morning, everyone, and thanks for joining us for our webinar this morning. Our webinar today is titled High Performance Culture in the Tertiary Sector. So my name's Megan and I'm a consultant here at Curve Group, and I'll be your host for today's session. But before we continue, I just wanted to confirm that everybody can hear us loud and clear and can also see our presentation. So you can do this by either clicking the raise your hand icon on your dashboard or just typing us a message. Okay, thank you. Great, so it's looking like everybody can see our presentation and can hear us loud and clear, which is great. So thank you all for being here this morning. We've had loads of interest around this webinar today, and unfortunately there were some people that couldn't make it due to other commitments, so we'll make sure that we have our recording and our presentation available after our webinar. So I'd now like to cover a few housekeeping things before we get started, just to make sure our session runs as smoothly as possible. So the structure of our webinar will include a presentation which will run for about 40 minutes, and then we'll have some time for a question and answer session. So you'll notice there's a control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. So you can use that to type and send in your questions, and you can also use it to hit the hand icon button, which a few of you have already used, which is great. In terms of your questions throughout the presentation, we'd ask that you actually send them in as we go rather than waiting to the end, and that just gives us a chance to collate your questions in order to answer as many as we can in that time at the end of the session. So we'll do our best to address all of your questions, but if we find that we're running out of time, we'll ensure that we follow up post the webinar session via email, or we can give you a call. So we'll also be providing our slides today if you wish to share them with others. Also, please feel free to send through any communications through the chat function as we go today, particularly if you're having any technical issues. We're happy to help throughout the presentation. So to give you a brief background on Curve Group, on who we are, we're a business improvement consultancy firm, and our expertise really lies in aligning people to strategy through capability, culture and change. So on the screen you'll find our service framework, and this really reflects our key service areas. The first one in blue you'll see is inform, and this is where we clarify business challenges through diagnostic type activities. The second, create, is where we work to connect people to strategy. And finally, in yellow, you'll see activate. So that's where we enable effective execution. So to understand more about any of our particular service offerings or to read any case studies of work we've done, feel free to visit our website, curvegroup.com, or our homepage on LinkedIn. So I'd now like to introduce our presenters for today. We've got Dylan Flavell, who's the Managing Director of Curve, and Theo Gouskos, who's the partner at Greenshoot Consulting. So we'll be partnering with Theo for today's presentation. So I'll give you a brief background on both of our presenters before I hand over for the final presentation. So in terms of Dylan, he's had over 18 years of experience working in a range of roles across a variety of sectors, and he's also worked in Australia but also in Europe. So his 12 years of consulting spans most sectors, including the tertiary sector. So Dylan has a Bachelor of Science from the University of Melbourne and also some psychology degrees, and he's actually a registered business psychologist. So Dylan's experience in org transformation and performance culture is his key areas of expertise, and this includes things like leadership engagement, organisational diagnostics, and change program design and implementation. Theo, I'm just going to, thank you. So Theo's actually spent a large portion of his career working in the tertiary sector. So he spent about 15 years working in the tertiary sector. So we're really excited to have him on board to present in our webinar this morning. So he's had a Bachelor of Science also at Melbourne, and he's also the Director on the Board of Indigenous Architecture and Design in Victoria. Theo's worked in senior exec level roles, where he's provided strategic leadership to achieve a range of organisational objectives in socially complex environments. So he's had extensive experience in vision setting and partnerships across a variety of industry engagements, fundraising, and he's also developed a range of frameworks to support evidence-based decision-making as part of a focus on continuous business improvement. So that's just a bit of background around our two presenters for today. So I'd like to hand over to Dylan, who will take us through just our structure for our discussion and then get us started. Thanks, Dylan.
Thank you. Thanks, Meg. Thanks, everyone, for joining us today. We appreciate you coming and spending some time. Theo and I have known each other for quite a while and in different capacities. And I guess the genesis of today was thinking about how we bring together his unique background in the tertiary sector and our background, which has been partly formed in that industry sector, but is really about helping organisations align people to strategy, as Meg talked to before. So we thought it'd be a great time to spend talking about the way those two things intersect. We're going to start by giving you some of the university sector context, which you will know well, but Theo's going to help us think through what is the big macro change happening in that industry sector. We're going to talk about some of the ingredients that from our experience we've seen as being important in driving cultural change. And we're going to share a cultural change framework that we've used and that we've seen other leading tertiary institutions using around the world. We're then going to share some case studies in brief from the University of Michigan and the University of North Texas, where they have adopted a particular framework for thinking about culture change. And then we're just going to briefly touch on some of the really interesting and exciting performance culture initiative we're seeing play out in the Australian university sector. We'll summarise our key takeouts and then leave a little bit of time for your questions. So that's our agenda for the next 35 minutes or so. So I'll hand to Theo to talk about our university sector context. And thanks for being with us today, Theo.
No, thank you, Dylan. Thanks for the invitation. As many of you will be aware, there are a number of forces that are driving change in the tertiary education sector, and this slide seeks to outline some of them. We'll all be familiar with the fact that there are declines in university funding, and it is no surprise that relative public funding per student in Australian universities is around 30% of the OECD average. This consequently results in significant constrained resourcing and making it incredibly challenging to deliver the level of service that students are now expecting from a university education and from a university experience. There's been an increase in demand for workplace readiness as the labour market has become more and more competitive, and there has been a renewed focus on industry collaboration as a source of revenue diversification to address some of the gaps that we're seeing in university funding. Straddling all of this has been the evolution of the digital disruption in online learning, online and blended learning, giving students a lot more variety of choices in the way in which they seek to develop their academic training, and this has consequently resulted in significant competition amongst students in the tertiary education sector. So a lot of these factors and a lot of these forces ultimately, I think, reflect struggle between an external and internal alignment. And one of the things that I wanted to talk about was some of the successes that can happen when we're able to align external and internal factors. And I'm reminded of the work of Professor Hugh Taylor at the University of Melbourne, who's a leading ophthalmologist. And in 2010, he successfully aligned his work with stakeholders in the philanthropic sector, industry and government, and raised in the vicinity of $22 million to eradicate trachoma from Indigenous communities across Australia. And again, it demonstrates what's possible when we are effective at aligning some of these various forces that are at play in the tertiary education sector. Alignment is a challenge, and we think that it's a challenge because there are a number of tensions that compete within the tertiary sector and can really impact on the way in which organisational culture develops. These tensions include, and are listed below, the need to undertake independent research, yet to have a level of industry relevance. Research that informs teaching and curriculum development, but this pressure to ensure that our students graduate with the skills that make them workplace ready. A strong push across Australia towards alumni engagement, recognising that a consequence of that will be fundraising and development. Intense competition for funding, yet again a recognition that through collaboration and partnership we can be more effective at attracting resources to various institutions. And the educational pedagogy, which is about developing our technical expertise in lab heads and program leaders, sometimes comes at the expense of leadership development. So we think that these tensions are incredibly challenging, and I want to focus a little bit more on one of these, and we've called this rigour versus relevance. And rigour, we're referring to the pedagogical approach focused on research, informing curriculum development, and a desire to maintain academic excellence and independence. And historically, in universities, there have been very few opportunities for professional experience and work integrated learning. Yet today, in the context of the Australian higher education sector, we've seen a significant increase in the number of people engaging in university, and employers now looking for more than just a degree. We know that students and graduates are looking for employment outcomes, and some of their decision-making criteria include university experience and course experience as a mechanism of deciding which university to attend. So competition for students is driving change, and universities once concerned with quotas are now heavily focusing on actively recruiting students in a very difficult market. So I want to hand back to Dylan now to talk a bit more about the culture change and key ingredients in any organisation.
Yep, thanks, Theo. So yeah, terrific context. I think in our work generally consulting across industries, we're seeing a lot of change, a lot of disruptive change, and I think Theo's really pointed to the factors that are driving that in the tertiary sector, which are no different. I want to just change tack a little bit now to talk about firstly the things that we see as being critical in driving culture change in any organisation, and then I want to talk a little bit about what we see as being maybe the critical factors and maybe unique factors, particularly in the tertiary sector. So I've listed 5 or 6 particular points down there, which, depending on your background, some of them will be not surprising to you as things that are the key ingredients for bringing culture change to life. The first and most important, I think, would mostly recognise is a willing leadership to engage in change, and leaders with a vision and an agenda for change. And that's always important, and is the ultimate blocker if that's not in place. Second thing that we see is really important to any change work we do is a level of data to provide an evidence base for change, not just for change, but also for self-reflection from leaders and from teams to think about current practice and how that's mapping to aspired outcomes. We're also strong believers that a framework, some form of thinking framework or framework that reflects organisational reality is required, and typically we see that as being one that helps bring complexity to life in a way that's understandable and drives action. And so we often think about systemic thinking and decision-making elements as being really important for any framework, particularly if it's going to be a diagnostic framework to help leaders and organisations understand current and future aspired performance. and a change approach that's not just about what, but it's about how. Are the right stakeholders involved in both problem articulation and solution generation? And we generally find when we're asking people to change that their involvement in articulating and solution generation around that change is critical to success. What we really think is important in most contexts is a way to be able to articulate the performance link between what you're driving for from an outcomes perspective and the particular change levers that are more important to arriving at particular performance outcomes. We often go in and do change work and find there are many things to do, but being able to prioritise which things are most important based on the particular outcomes your organisation is seeking is a really is a key catalyst for effective leader sponsorship and action. And finally, just the discipline around a clear change plan. Sometimes we talk about culture change and it can feel a bit esoteric and humanistic and broad, but we are firm believers that being able to bolt that down into a clear change plan with action that helps people rally around particular initiatives and see progress is really important. So I don't think many of those will be too new to many of you, but I'd like to just maybe go to the next slide to talk about three from our experience of working in the culture change and change environment that are really, really important to driving change in the tertiary sector. The first thing that we've experienced is that there is a unique leadership culture in tertiary organisations, and typically that's characterised by professional leaders and academic leaders, both with their own strengths and attributes. But I think it's really important to recognise that if you are looking for that first point of getting a willing and aligned leadership team, being able to recognise the different drivers of professional leaders and academic leaders, and being able to potentially engage them in a different way at the outset of a piece of work is fundamentally important, because they're not always aligned on the same outcomes or the same endpoints. So that for us is a critical change catalyst and culture catalyst in tertiary organisations. Our experience is that there's very strong faculty alignment, and I'm sure for people listening in here today, you will have strong experience of that. Universities are typically quite siloed, and they take strong pride in the performance of their faculty and the work that they do there, which can be at the detriment of a whole of university approach. For us, it's really interesting to think about what that means in terms of culture change. Do you go at it at a whole of university or whole of organisation level, or do you start at a more tactical or at a faculty level change? We think that both are possible, but require really conscious decision making about what and how you go about doing that. And sometimes we think it's really important to be able to swim with the current. Is some language we use, which is saying the energy is often within faculties and identity is there. So how do you use that energy in a positive way and not spend a lot of time fighting against it? Finally, we know from our work, and Theo has shared many experiences himself, that there are really strong and distinct cultural attributes within tertiary organisations and settings. One of those is a strong and regard for process and bureaucratic process that can be hard to break when that's sought as a key change. And for us, we've certainly experienced the need to recognise that if that is a path that you're taking as one lever of performance culture change, you need to be just really aware of the level of entrenched practice around that, so that you can sustain your effort, or just to be really conscious that there are other levers that you can pull, and you just need to be really deliberate about what and when and how you're doing those. There are more, and I think that you'd be able to name more as well, but we see those two, if you like, ingredients as being really important in driving change. I guess where I'd like to shift to now before we move into our case studies is to introduce a framework or a model that we use and endorse, I suppose, as a way of thinking about performance culture change. And it's a framework that integrates many of the elements that I've just talked about in the last 5 minutes, relating to systemic thinking, data and evidence-based approach, a link to performance outcomes. This framework that we're going to introduce is called the Denison model, and it also happens to be a framework that has been used and adopted by a number of leading international organisations, tertiary institutions, and is the framework that are used by two in the case studies that we're going to share today. So I thought it appropriate to introduce this framework as a way of guiding our conversation and underpinning those case studies. So the Denison model that you've got in front of you now has quite a lot of information. So I'm just going to step through that in the next couple of minutes to help you understand what it is and what it does, and I guess why we like it and endorse it in many ways. And I should mention that we are the Australian and Asia partner for Denison. So it's a framework and tool that we use. It's not the only tool that we use, but it's certainly one that we endorse as having key ingredients that are important. So I guess the first characteristic of this model is that we would call it a systemic model, and it represents organisational life and effectiveness from all of its perspectives. You'll see there are 4 key quadrants to this model. There's the mission quadrant, which really talks to our clarity of strategic direction and our alignment around that, our clarity of goals and objectives, and just our vision. Do we know where we're going as an organisation? And we would say as a core part of any organisation's ability to succeed in the long term. On the bottom right-hand side is the orange component of this model, which is about consistency, and it's really about how, as an organisation, we work together and across organisational boundaries and even team boundaries with good processes. The quote down the bottom is, does our system create leverage? So are we working efficiently and effectively together in support of our customers and internal and external stakeholders? And the bottom left-hand side is something that you typically talk about a lot when you talk about performance culture, and it's really that involvement and people side of things. How empowered are people to make decisions? Do we work well as teams, and do we have the skills and capabilities required to meet our strategic objectives? Are people engaged in their work effectively? And then a top left-hand side is really about how adaptable we are to the external market. So do we know who our customers and stakeholders are? Do we know how to listen to them and respond to their needs? And when we do get data around that, are we able to create change? So can we create change? And does our organisation learn from its past mistakes? So you can see that quote there in the blue box at the top left is, are we listening to the marketplace? So this is a framework that we use. As you can see, it's got 4 key elements. There are tensions that exist within this model, and Theo started to point towards some of those before. We could spend a long time talking about the many different tensions that play out, but the key one that Theo talked about was the fact that in his experience, tertiary institutions have been in many ways internally focused for a long period of time, and are now seeking or needing to, because of the external marketplace, needing to look towards the external focus. So our internal factors are, how do we operate together? What are our systems and processes versus our external focus on what are our competitors doing? What are our stakeholder needs? And how do we ensure that our internal practice is appropriate to our external environment? There are many others, and you could map all of the competing tensions that Theo talked about earlier across this model, which I won't do now. But it's a key factor of this model is that it helps explain competing demands in organisational life, which is critical in being able to help leaders work together to recognise that there are competing agendas and competing needs that we need to put on the table and discuss to try and find the mutual solution, or the solution that what we often call the and solution. It's not an either or an either. It's not about whether we're focused externally or internally. We need to do both. So we find this is a really valuable model in being able to have that leadership discussion, which is where culture change starts. Final slide I'd like to share, just in talking about this model, which is a really important part of it, we think, is the fact that this model has a very, very extensive research base, and the research base is based on organisational performance and sustainability over time. So it started with a focus on what are the characteristics of organisations and tertiary institutions that make them sustainable, and then what are the factors that actually lead to their success. So you'll see around the model here, we've got 4 boxes which describe typical outcomes. So in the top part of that slide talks to enrolment. So how are we going relative to competitors, and are we winning in the marketplace, if you like, around being able to attract and enrol students? Philanthropic revenue, are we able to attract that to do the work that we need to do? On the right-hand side, things like research income, and operational efficiency. So are we able to operate in a way that means we're sustainable over a long period of time? At the bottom area, you'll see research output, employee satisfaction and retention. And then at the left, as Theo talks heavily about, student satisfaction, are we meeting the needs of the marketplace through the innovative program design that we're going about? So there's some of the performance outcomes that are linked to this model. And the final point I would make is that when you look at the 12 indices that characterize this framework, the particular performance measures or metrics on the outside relate most closely to those indices that are closest to them. So, for example, innovation and student satisfaction are the outcomes you get when you focus more on your customers and your stakeholders, when you're an organisation that can create change quickly, when you empower your employees internally to work together and be able to make decisions. They're the outcomes you tend to get. So it's this framework helps prioritise the action or efforts or initiatives that you put in place to achieve particular outcomes. And we find this is a really important thing in culture change in any organisation, because it helps leaders have a input and output discussion rather than just talking about culture without a link to external performance.
And Dylan, if I could just add, I think that this model is really terrific in capturing and making sense of the complexity involved in operating effectively in a tertiary environment, whilst balancing the needs between external and internal stakeholders. And it certainly is an approach that leads to outcomes, and as you said, is evidence-based. And it's terrific, I think, that we can focus on our 2 case studies to talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I think, thanks, Theo, and I think that's right. I mean, definitely, I think that's a challenge that we find all organisations face with when they think about culture, is that it has many handles for many different people and can be described in many different ways, and that's because there's a level of complexity to it. And I guess this framework has a way of helping try to unpick that, so to help people understand where to start, I guess, in many ways. So I think that's enough of me rattling on about that framework, but we want to continue to reference it, but within the context of 2 case studies that we've prepared. And they're short case studies. I might just take a moment to describe why we've chosen the case studies that we've chosen. We've chosen 2 international case studies, the first being from the University of Michigan and the second being from the University of North Texas. We've chosen the University of Michigan and North Texas firstly because they've used this model and framework, and they're 2 of many tertiary organisations, particularly through the United States, who are choosing to go down this type of path. But the University of Michigan are a leading global organisation or tertiary organisation. They're ranked number 19 in the world, and they certainly demonstrate the attributes that we know we're seeking to achieve through the Australian tertiary sector, but they are experiencing exactly the same challenges and pressures. Differently, we've chosen the University of North Texas as our second case study because they've been using this and have developed excellent longitudinal data to show the impact of their investment of effort in this approach over time. So I'm going to hand to Theo to kick off our case study on the University of Michigan.
Thanks, Dylan. So as Dylan was saying, the University of Michigan ranked number 19 in the world in the most recent Times Higher Education ranking of universities. It's a clinical teaching hospital delivering a very prestigious cardiologist fellowship program. I think it trains about 25 cardiologists each year who will become the leaders in their field. They experienced a ranking slide, and the sentiment of the director was that the fellows' experience was sort of falling short of their expectations, and there wasn't that engaged experience of the fellows where they felt part of a cohort and that ongoing connection to a fairly prestigious program. So one of their objectives was to reinstate their rankings, to stop the slide, and to make a more meaningful mindset shift to recognise the possibility of change and improvement, and to create a collective fellow experience and a shift from a past focus on individuals, and to create this sense of cohort and to actually start operating much more like an organisation, which is a really, really big thing if you're part of a traditional teaching hospital setting. And they also wanted to further enhance their alumni that advocate and sponsor future programs for the fellowship.
Yeah, so I think Theo's painted the picture there, and I think the main driver was really how do we help develop a strong alumni in the future that will advocate for this program, because their collective experience together was such a fantastic experience, as opposed to a collection of individuals competing for a great personal outcome. So, Peter Hagen, his approach to this was to try and run this fellowship and faculty as an organisation, and so he thought, what better way than to bring in an organisational culture survey that helps our fellows and our faculty to both gather data about how we work systemically and then make decisions on that as you would in any organisational setting. So they used the Denison Organisational Culture Survey, and they found some really interesting things. And the fellows' views and ownership of the data was a key element of this, that they were in charge of analysing, supporting and sponsoring decision-making and action across the faculty. What they found was, I guess in some ways, in many ways, reflective of the experience that fellows were having. So they showed that there were very low levels of mentorship. So fellows were experiencing a lot of support by others in the faculty. And one of the main reasons for this were the different drivers that Theo talked about before. Others in the faculty were very, very focused on research. They weren't focused on supporting fellows through the program. There was a very low sense of connection, and I guess we already mentioned that, but there were very few opportunities or programs in place to facilitate connection between peers, immediate peers, or even just generally people through the faculty. So activities weren't available for people to develop a shared experience. Probably most importantly was the finding that supervisor capabilities to manage and manage people were amongst the most critical determinants of the fellow experience. But in fact, they weren't managed. So the only reason that a good supervisor might emerge was because they had personal interest in managing people, or they had a strong personality style that oriented them towards that. But there was no management or oversight or investment in that. So it was a very, very spec experience. So they were leaving the experience of their fellows to chance, purely to chance. They've done a number of things, and the work at the University of Michigan is about 9 months old, and they're about to go through and reassess and retest their data. But they have implemented a supervisor development program to ensure that the technical experience of fellows is complemented by a great leadership experience as well, or manager relationship. They've implemented a number of connection and collaboration programs within the faculty. One of them they're very proud of is Beer with a Peer, which is a way for people to connect socially, but whilst simple, has been amazingly effective in an organisation that has not had a focus on facilitating connection and collaboration. In fact, quite the opposite. They're about to go about reassessing their culture data, but they're also going to go about doing a Leadership 360. And so the Denison toolset has a leadership assessment tool to help leaders understand their impact on culture through that aligned assessment tool. Whilst there isn't longitudinal data on this case at the moment, anecdotal feedback from Peter and the team is that there's a palpable difference. People are in control of decision making. They get a much broader experience, and it's a shared experience. So it's a great example, and we think it reflects many of the similar characteristics that we see in the Australian marketplace as well. So I might just hand to Theo now to move on to our case study at the University of North Texas, which has been going for a number of years and has some fantastic longitudinal data. So I'll hand over to Theo to talk to that.
Thanks again, Dylan. So University of North Texas Health Science Center is one of 9 public health schools in North Texas, and it trains approximately 1,600 students and employs 1,300 staff. And typical of many institutions, each of the schools and departments were very autonomous, and I guess to the point of being siloed. They faced a number of challenges which I think resonate in the Australian context, including things that we've mentioned previously, such as increased competition for students, increased demands for accountability, previously not seen that in the academic settings, concerns about declining federal funding for research, new research models that were driving funding agencies. And their aspiration was to be a top 10 health science centre in the US. So they took the approach of developing a strategic plan for the organisation and employed a new leader. In 2007, they used the Denison Organisational Cultural Survey, and despite high scores in mission and the core values indices, there was much room for improvement. But what was really encouraging, I think, that they had a very strong foundation in mission and core values from which to embark upon. They sought to change their culture, and they did this based on 4 basic tenets: alignment, accountability, transparency, and teamwork. And I think in many respects, the leadership at the University of North Texas Health Science Center had incredible foresight to create a leadership development institute, which concentrated on providing the requisite training to ensure that the leaders there could be the best that they could be. They created, most importantly, an office of strategy and measurement to actually start measuring the impact of some of their activities and to assess how effective they've been in transforming culture. They worked with each team member individually and developed a written set of performance expectations, of course, with stretch targets. And I think really uniquely, they developed individual goals as well as team goals, which reinforced a dependency and teamwork across department and functional boundaries, which I think went a long way to addressing the issues of silos and not working in a collaborative process. But for me, I think the most astounding aspect of this work relates to some of the outcomes that were measured after a 5-year time frame. And if we have a look at this particular slide, we see that total revenue jumps 91%, or in the vicinity of $100 million in that time frame, whilst at the same time there was an incredible downwards pressure and a 35% drop in admin costs. Student enrolments increased 51%. The dollar value of grants, I think, is a marker of the success in collaborating, increased 70%. The number of patients in which they dealt with, again, significant increases. And for me, I think the one that really resonates is the number of alumni donors and employee donors. So alumni donors being a surrogate marker of an external constituent's engagement with a organisation, and the employee donors reflecting a surrogate marker of employee satisfaction, if you will. An almost doubling of the number of employee donors and a 600% increase in alumni donors. Is this significant? I think yes, because when one looks at the amount of gifts that they received, in 2005 they were generating about $1 million in philanthropic income, which jumped to $30 million in 2010. I think by all measures, the fact that they've addressed some of these issues that universities in Australia are experiencing today through this cultural framework have resulted in a significant impact in the performance of the organisation. And I think there's some really key learnings that we can take from that, including invest in leadership, measure change, and I guess be in it for the long term, measure it over a long time frame.
So maybe one thing I would add before we just talk very briefly to that next slide, and then maybe we'd love to hear any questions that you have about either of those case studies. I should share that we could have shared quite a lot more about that that University of North Texas case study. We've got a detailed case study on that show their data, their Denison data improvement over time. So we can certainly share that if that's of interest to you. please just email us and let us know. So before we do take some questions, we've just mapped there some of the local, if you like, Australian initiatives, performance culture initiatives that we've seen and have been involved in or are involved in at the moment. Theo, I might ask you to just really talk for 30 seconds on the top two, the things that represent external focus or external focused initiatives, and I'll talk briefly to the bottom two.
Okay, thanks, Dylan. So, in working with a group of 8 universities in Australia, we've done some work in and around embedding professional experience in 3 dimensions of the university, graduate attributes, in teaching and curriculum development and research. So we've worked with the executive around implementing that, as well as creating a stakeholder engagement framework and prioritisation framework to really concentrate activities in that domain, which the faculty that we were working with hadn't been involved in before.
Yeah, so very much an external, if you call it adaptability or external customer and stakeholder focused piece of work. And that mission piece of work, Theo, maybe just describe that.
So the visioning work was in and around expanding on the university strategic plan, a new university strategic plan from 2015 to 2020, which sought to create and leverage connections with industry to expand the career readiness and opportunities of students to be effective in the workplace. So we worked in defining that mission and vision for one of the faculties to ensure that there were systems and processes inbuilt to facilitate those outcomes.
Okay, and I'll just mention the two down the bottom in that sort of more internal focus. So in the bottom left-hand side in the involvement sector segment, we've been working with a number of universities around how to support them to develop organisational capability frameworks and linked activities to develop capability, both across the technical and professional domains. So I guess that just really reflects a very conscious decision by a couple of universities in particular that we've been lucky enough to partner with to get very deliberate about describing those capabilities that are going to be needed for future success and for some of the challenges we talked about in the marketplace, and put in place a deliberate approach to developing those. Over in that consistency sector is some work that we've been doing now for a number of years with 2 different universities. We call it collaborative process simplification. We know there's a lot of process work happening across the university sector. What we do find is that to be successful, it's really important that it's a highly facilitative approach rather than a black box approach. For us, that means involving those who are involved in executing the processes or putting in place the change, involving them in the actual redesign and change process, so that when new processes need to be rolled out, people are on board rather than defaulting to old ways of working. So it's work that we sometimes talk about doing some of the heavy lifting early, because it can be more time consuming up front, but drives greater change and traction at the end. So we thought we'd just describe briefly some of those, but we of course would be happy to talk to anybody about those examples or some of the other examples of performance culture initiatives that are about aligning people to change and strategy in person, of course. So I thought maybe some key takeouts. Well, we've got a big slide here. But our key takeouts before, we'd love to hear any questions in our last sort of 10 or so minutes. As you've heard, the tertiary sector's faced with disruptive change, no different to other parts of the market. But we are seeing leading global and domestic universities begin to do something and begin to act and take control of how we respond to that. As Theo talked to early, there are tensions in all organisations, and the tertiary sector is no different. Being able to firstly recognise and then consciously manage those, we think, is at the heart of transformational change, and we've obviously shared a strong framework that we think helps that. There are strong and unique attributes of organisational culture within universities, and any approach to culture change needs to understand and manage those in a conscious way, we think. we shared the quality, what we believe is a great performance culture framework and an underpinning diagnostic tool that helps to understand that complexity, and also we think plays towards the inherent biases within the tertiary sector, which is a bias towards evidence, data and rigour, to provide insights into change. Finally, I think a key takeout is that the initiatives that we talked about to shift the needle, whether it was through the 2 case studies or through the 4 little snapshots of initiatives currently in play for us, all of them are about improving alignment. They're all about improving alignment of people and work practices, either through vision work, through improved processes that we know about and we're aligned to, whether it's about the critical capabilities that reflect and align with our strategy, or whether it's about taking an aligned approach to the way we interact with our customers and stakeholders. So they're probably our key takeouts from today, but we would love to hear any questions that you might have. So we might hold for 30 seconds while we gather those, Meg.
Thank you. Thanks, Dylan. So we hope you've enjoyed the presentation part of our webinar today. And we'd like to take sort of the last 10 or so minutes just to explore some of the questions that have been sent throughout the webinar. So we've had a number of questions that have been sent through, but unfortunately we may not have time to cover them all. If we don't get to your question, we'll make sure that we follow up with you with an email at the end. But we might start with the question for Dylan and Theo, and the question reads, I have a question regarding the leadership culture differences mentioned. How have you seen that play out in practice, and how did you or have you managed that? I'll just pass to Dylan and Theo for that first question.
Yeah, okay, a good question. Thank you. Thank you for that. So I think probably a good example of that is in some work that we are still involved in, and have been involved in for a period of time, which really is really focused on organisational redesign work. And I think the key point I had made is that there are different leaders and professional leaders and academic leaders, and sometimes they come to the table with a different approach to either change or a different mindset to change. And I think we found in this particular circumstance that up front there were quite different drivers or mindsets about how, or actually the rationale for change, and even the approach that you might go about. More practically, what that means is that we found that there was within the professional sphere maybe a greater leaning towards transparency of communication and dialogue around what the change outcome and intent was, and maybe an approach to change from other leaders, which was a little less transparent about how to communicate change up front and the drivers for change. And we just found that for us, when we saw small signals of differences, both in what different leaders were trying to get out of this, whether one was about cost and the other one was about driving technical excellence, we needed to be really clear about being able to name those, so that when we went out to support that change with the faculty, we could be clear and transparent and have integrity about the conversation we're having from the start, because we find if a change conversation starts with a particular narrative that changes quite sharply throughout, then that doesn't help the change effort. So for us, being able to see incongruence between leaders' views about what the change needs to achieve and how to achieve that is not unusual, but it's just something that we needed to be able to facilitate that dialogue with those two leaders to help them align. And yeah, it wasn't something that we think maybe would naturally have happened because of the two different styles without a form of just facilitating that dialogue. So for us, yeah, a good example is seeing difference and just actively managing that good, healthy conversation up front to ensure that there was alignment, rather than recognising that halfway through the project or recognising that was derailing things a little bit. I think that can even come down to just very practical things around the communication style that you might see in your professional staff versus academic staff, and just being able to make sure that they're recognised and both appreciated and valued, and that we reflect our own communication style to those people in the same way. That's one little example I think I've got of that one, but I think it's a great question.
So another question we've had sent in is great international case studies using the Denison framework. So this particular individual was interested to know what's your experience of that in Australia?
Yeah, thank you. So we are, I think I mentioned, we are the Australian and Asian partner to Denison, and we have been for a number of years. So we've worked with them both in the university context in Australia, as well as across all industry contexts using the Denison framework and tools. So there are two particular universities in Australia that we've used the docs to the Denison Organisational Culture Survey to survey their organisation. And there are many others across other industries where we've used that, as well as the leadership 360 tools to support. So I think the question may even play to, I guess the fact that we shared international case studies, and we were quite deliberate to do that because we think there's some interesting things happening, and it's really interesting to hear what others are doing with a framework that's being used and a methodology that we're using here in Australia.
And I guess as part of that, I've had the opportunity to use that framework, not the diagnostic aspect of it, but more so the conceptual framework in a group of 8 university that sought to, and I mentioned it briefly before, embed professional experience throughout their programs. And this certainly required a transformational approach in the faculty in maximising opportunities for excellence, utilising professional experience in various programs. So we used that model in being able to set the vision that integrated professional experience across a number of different domains. We used it to facilitate the strategic and operational planning, stakeholder mapping, and the partnership prioritisation frameworks. And I think really importantly, and going back to that point, Dylan, it's about being an instrument to facilitate an alignment between internal and external stakeholders. It has been tremendously useful as a starting point to make sense of some really difficult and challenging competing tensions and create an evidence-based solution and roadmap to achieve organisational wide objectives.
Yep. So unfortunately, we're running a little bit tight on time, so we may need to actually wrap up our session, but we'll be sure to follow up with those who we didn't get to answer your questions today. So that brings us to the end of our webinar today, so high performance culture in the tertiary sector. So we hope you've really enjoyed the presentation today, and we really look forward to continuing the conversation with you. So as we said, if you've got any further questions or anything that you're keen to have a chat with us about, feel free to send us an email, contact us through our LinkedIn, and we've also got our phone number there as well. So we'll be sure to send you the slide pack for today's webinar presentation, and you'll also be able to find our recording on our website. So I'll just throw to Dylan and Theo just to close off.
Thank you, Megan, for hosting today, and I'd just like to thank Theo for coming in today. It's great to be able to share deep industry expertise and knowledge, and really combine that with some of the more technical discipline of culture change work that we often engage in. I suppose that in itself is an example of an internal and external challenge that we're seeing happen within the tertiary sector itself. So thanks, Theo.
No, thank you, Dylan, and thanks to Megan for hosting. It's been really tremendous to be part of it.
Thanks for attending, folks.
Thank you.